Welcome back and welcome to another podcast of Comply or Die. I'm your host, Kyle, and today I've got two guys I really, really like. Maybe I should say that off the bat because they'll give me better answers today, but we've got Nick and we've got Steve with us today. Nick and Steve collectively are security ideals. So maybe just to start there, security ideals, what do they do? Compliance service provider. Hey, we've heard that before on your podcast a bit, so we might have a pretty good conversation today. What are these gentlemen doing? Well, providing some expert security professional services, helping with audit compliance. This ranges from all the different frameworks you've heard and we've mentioned on this podcast. SOC, ISO, you name it, they're going to touch on it more shortly. And Steve, I know you've got a lot of experience in a ton of the other regulatory frameworks as well. We're going to deep dive on those today as well. So quick intro from my side for our two guests today. Steve, the VP of Security Compliance at Security Ideals. Nick, Principal and Founder. If I've got that wrong, you're welcome to call me out in a sec. So Steve, I've actually had the pleasure of working with on one of the companies that I've worked quite closely with for the past 2-3 years, I think. Steve's background, first and foremost, an Army veteran. He works as an IT director, IT consultant, ton of experience in everything network, infrastructure, and compliance related. Nick, also a real veteran in the industry, has experience from IT management, CEO of NBG Networks, if I'm not mistaken, as well as some different CISO roles, as well as a ton of industry certifications. So maybe let me quickly stop there. Gentlemen, welcome to the podcast. What have I got wrong and what have I left out?
I don't know. I think we hired Kyle as our hype man. That was awesome.
Yeah, that's a nice intro, Kyle. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think you got it pretty much spot on. I mean, the only thing I would add is that we do a lot of technical testing as well at Security Ideals. So we do a lot of penetration testing for customers as well on top of the compliance pieces that you mentioned in the intro here. But I think you got it pretty much spot on. Both Steve and I come out of larger corporate compliance space and kind of organizations that have a more traditional framework. And now we've taken that learning and we're trying to apply that to newer organizations. So startups and also companies that are just moving fast and they're trying to tackle compliance. It's coming at them many different ways and they sell their product into different industries and different locations.
Amazing. And look, the conversation today for all of our guests, maybe first to set a bit of a scene and just the enablement. It's nothing cool at this point in time, but well, we're on very different sides of the world right now. I'm just about wrapping up my day. Steve and Nick, Steve's already made a comment, busy getting his first or second, Steve, caffeine hit
I'm
for
on
the day.
number 2, so yeah, number 2
So
coffee.
if we see you start jumping up and down shortly, we'll know that the caffeine's doing its thing. So yeah, I mean, that's a very cool place where technology has just enabled the world to connect. It's something I'm pretty grateful for. Wouldn't have met the likes of you gentlemen without it, and how we can quite easily connect by hopping on a call. I will admit we might have had a couple technical difficulties getting the start of this call going, but no matter how advanced we get in tech, the simple things will always confuse us and cause some challenges. So for all our listeners today, see this one as a bit of a couch conversation, if you will, talking everything security compliance. And both of you you've known each other for a little while, right? Whoever wants to take it first, let's begin there. What actually got you into security compliance?
You go ahead, Nick.
Okay.
My coffee.
So Steve and I have actually worked together for about 25 years, Kyle. So on and off at different organizations. So quite a while, actually. The majority of our careers, I guess, actually probably been spent, kind of working together in departments in different roles or, kind of in lockstep. So we've gone through quite a bit. My background was in IT and Steve's as well, and working in a consulting kind of environment about 20 years ago. And then we both migrated from there to running in-house IT departments and doing a bit more on the compliance and security side because we both came out of healthcare specialty. So healthcare kind of mandated us to, as time grew up through HIPAA, which I think came out in 1996, something like that. So, going on 30 years now or something. But, and then into some of the more rigid frameworks, which we know today as SOC 2, but, back then we had SSA 16 and SEC 70s and all kinds of other audit reports that were available to companies and working through that. And then into some of the healthcare specific realms like high trust. And also we did a lot of payments. So we did a lot of PCI work as well. And then coming through all of that and then seeing the changes in the industry have been pretty cool. Like there were really no GRC tools that were utilized for audit, 10 years ago, even seeing the changes in that space has been pretty cool. That's been my background. Steve, you kind of sort of similar background?
Yeah, very similar. Started out off at that mom and pop shop, working at a place. I mean, we did everything from like building what do they call it? Microsoft small business servers to, fixing email on people's desktops and, working there. Then, yeah, you and I both kind of split off and did our own things and then came back together and rocked it over there at that medical billing company.
Yep. And we've been doing security consulting for really organizations of all size, but generally startups for the past 4 years now, helping get through items like SOC 2, ISO 27001, some more bespoke frameworks as well. Steve works on the financial side with all the different requirements for financial services companies, but really applying what we learned in healthcare to, kind of the broader market, I guess, if that makes sense.
And maybe a curiosity question, if I'm allowed to. What got you to sort of leave and go and start Security Ideals? What was that turning point?
I know for me, just the ability to continually grow. I'm the kind of person who always wants to do more. So, I think being able to have the opportunity to see different types of organizations and not just always be micro-focused in kind of enterprise healthcare was nice to branch out a bit and, get to experience some of the other areas. Like, it's been cool working. We have some security contractors we work with that sell software directly to the government. That's been interesting and a very different kind of marketplace in the government side of things. And the CMC ramping up, I would imagine that's a topic that people are running into now if they're selling directly to government space or through one of the primes. So that's been pretty cool. And then also working a bit in oil and gas, which is neat too, which is just not a vertical that I had any experience in. So really just the opportunity, I think, to expand and try some different things and not always be kind of micro-focused. And for me, that was the big driving factor. I don't know, for Steve.
Yeah, very similar. Just the day-to-day operations, only got boring after a while. And I just, you wanted to level up into something. And then this was certainly the way to level up, getting your CISP and then moving into the security side. So that's kind of like the way I took it.
And from all the different industries you've been exposed to, I mean, you've mentioned a ton now already. I don't want to say what do you like most and what do you like least. So maybe both being very curious and striving for that growth the whole time. What do you find is most repetitive, if you can? And what's the most sort of challenging frameworks you come across or deal with?
Thanks, Steve.
I mean, I was thinking you kind of on a different way, like, when we're first introduced to a client, they have to get SOC 2 and like, they're just a mess, right? They don't even know how much of a mess they are. They have no idea the mountain they're about to climb and how eventually when you get to the other side of it, how it like has fundamentally changed everything about their company and the way they thought about it and the way they do things. So I think that's kind of the most rewarding part, to finally get everybody on board to the way it's supposed to be and then continuing on, year after year.
Yeah, I agree. The rewarding part is seeing the project. Like if you can picture like a project flow chart, Gantt chart or something, like seeing those items get ticked off is always rewarding for me. I know that. I don't know if you agree, Steve, on that side of things, but I do think there's the biggest challenge is probably the knowledge gap in what customers expect these audits to incur or entail. Our typical customers we run into are like, hey, I'm building a really cool tech product. I'm trying to sell it to Kyle, and Kyle's asking me for this audit. And so they see that as we just need to go purchase this audit. Mm-hmm. What they don't always necessarily realize is that we have to be built in a way to be able to pass that audit and to be able to actually comply with whatever framework it may be. So if that's SOC 2, or we worked with a customer that was selling a product to a large delivery company and they require ISO for all their customers, for instance, ISO 27001 as a minimum. And so making sure you can explain to a company that has maybe only 10 employees at this time as they're growing, that you're going to try and tackle ISO 27001 series, like, can be done, but there's a lot of work there. And trying to educate on that, I think, is the biggest challenge I run into, because I can't tell you how many times I've had people call up. I had one last week that said, hey, we need a SOC 2 by next Friday. Like, how can we do that? Mm-hmm. Like, that's a normal conversation on a weekly basis that I have with potential customers, is like, how can we tackle an audit that typically turnaround time on is a few months? How can we tackle that in a week or two? And a lot of times, the answer is we can't, but here's what we can do. You can potentially negotiate your contracts, an extension, or some different, opportunities that are available to them. But I think that's been the biggest challenge, is just trying to educate the potential buyers out there, or the operating team that's being required to do this in some cases because of compliance, that, what this entails. It's not just an audit that they have to pay for and get a piece of paper back or report back. It's, you need to build an organization that's compliant in the first place to be able to work within that audit. And that's been, for me, that's the biggest challenge I run into repetitively.
So, I mean, for all our listeners, to summarize that, the most challenging aspect is the people. And look, I share that sentiment exactly as you say. And it's quite a cool thing if you actually think about it, right? The compliance, that's super technical. You're diving into some really, really intricate configurations of tools and systems. And the biggest challenge, like you're saying, is that education and understanding of what does it actually mean and how you get there. And I mean, being in a professional and customer-based service, we all know the customer is always right, and you've got to make that project work for them. But it is, I mean, from my space, sharing some of that, what we sort of come across quite often is largely similar, that the first step, often a customer targeting their SOC 2, they don't want the SOC 2, they want the business. They want to grow a successful, scalable business, and to then find that very, very delicate balance between, okay, we're going to get you your certificate so you can get into the market and get going, tied with all the parts of, okay, well, in order to cover a type 2 SOC 2, you need a production environment, you need customer data, and you've got customers requesting this before you've even had your go-to-market, and you get into that whole chicken and egg debate and argument. But finding that careful balance of, okay, you actually need proper controls. You cannot go into a SOC 2 audit with nothing in place. It actually means and represents something, but I have often seen that they're, again, going back to that balance, you want to implement what works for them, what's valuable, what's secure, and then creating that compliance or customer journey that year on year, okay, as you scale, as you grow, the maturity and nature of what controls you need changes vastly. In a 4-man company doing a, I don't know, user access review every week, well, look, if you're on a system and you see there's 5 people, it's pretty obvious something's going wrong there. Versus enterprise levels. And I mean, do you agree? Are you seeing the same?
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things we see a lot, and I call it aspirational security a lot of times, we'll see the urge or the real version of policy and procedure be very overstated for the size of organization. So to your example of a 4-person startup, trying to go through SOC 2, we've seen those come in with a policy pack of a couple hundred pages of policy. And then you dig into it and it's like, okay, we got this template that we found and we kind of worked up, and, we've been through it, and you start asking about like various items, like to your point of access control. Hey, it says here you're doing this thing once a week or once a month. Like, can you show us evidence of that? Oh, no, that was just from the template. Like, those are usually
or their policy still has company name in brackets all over the policy.
Yeah. So I think a lot of times there's an urge when companies are new, they feel like they're missing a couple of required items maybe to sell into that bigger marketplace. And their intuition is like, we need to kind of overbuild this policy packet, if you will, or this policy procedure statement. But the hard part of it is obviously they're going to be audited against those policies and those procedures. And so there's disconnect between where we really are and where we need to be, but the in-between is kind of that delta. And so trying to shrink that as much as possible is a big part of what we do. To be fair, is just to make sure that what we say is what we're actually doing in policy and procedure, and not more. We see a lot of the aspirational policy packs. Like, that's the number one thing that I run into that is just a constant in our field. I don't know about you, Steve, from your area.
Well, especially if the sales team is running the policy section of
so that happens.
Yeah, the sales team will want to just like, hey, they said we had to put this in here, so I just did it. Like, yeah, you get a lot of that.
Roles and assignments are always tricky with startups because I think everybody's wearing a lot of hats. So that's the other thing that I struggle with sometimes. We have, the chief operating officer kind of role is oftentimes doing IT and also doing, 3 other roles at the same time while building startups. And so a lot of times that operation area is the area tasked with, hey, go figure out this SOC 2 or this ISO or whatever it may need to be done in order to sell into a particular area. And so they're the ones tackling it, but sometimes they're the first IT person the company has hired in a way, or pseudo IT. They're the first security sort of person. Like, they kind of have all of those hats at once. And so trying to work through that, it can be challenging. But I think just managing expectations, like you said, Kyle, the people are really what we're talking about here. the technology and making sure, a particular encryption level is turned on or something is not that difficult typically. It's making sure, Steve will tell you how many times have we met customers that, let's say, have 100 employees and, a new policy update is completed. It needs to be re-signed by the whole company.
Hardest thing to do.
The point of contact will say, hey, we can have this re-signed in like 2 days. A month later, we're still chasing, Kyle, I'll pick on you, but we're still chasing Kyle for his signature because, Kyle was on an awesome vacation or holiday, for 3 weeks somewhere. And so I think the people side of it is always the part that I expect to be challenging and typically is.
And I mean that tick box exercise, right? Like you're saying, you chasing someone, or take your security control, like you've mentioned now, just to do training. We often aren't doing the training because, well, we want to improve our security hygiene. I got told I need to do this. I'm going to click next, and hope I get every answer correct. And I mean, we almost taking a technology compliance podcast here. We're turning this into a bit of a psychology lesson, but I often find the reality is exactly that value behind it. I mean, points in case your policies as well. Steve, your placeholders throughout it happens, right? And it's then a case of, okay, and I think you can separate it. Look, a detailed enough auditor going through things will pick those up. But in the vast amount of evidence that you are providing for an audit that provides reasonable assurance and typically not absolute assurance, and look, I think that's getting better and better over time, but something like that could slip through the cracks. And okay, cool, you've passed your audit, but now you've had some sort of incident or issue in the organization, and your policy is busy saying company name does this by the CISO that doesn't even operate in the company. And that then fights, which may be a little bit of a strong word, with the company to say, okay, instead of just spending 10 minutes on your policies, take the time, let's build it where you're going to work on a policy and you're going to work on what your controls and procedures are. And it then means it aligns. You're not going to sign it off, and for the next 4 years, you're going to work on updating a paragraph once a year.
Yeah. We learned that, jumping up and down, trying to get people to do things doesn't work. It doesn't align. You got to slightly nudge them. Just give them little nudges, just little reminders, and hopefully you can get them going in the right direction.
Yeah, that's definitely what we see, I think, with across our client base, but just that urge to trying to break that urge of kind of creating too much documentation or over documenting or over kind of embellishing your security program when you're starting out. I think trying to kind of break that urge a bit and just state like, hey, here's what we're doing today specifically. Obviously, if we're going for compliance framework, there may need to be some remediation. Like if we're not doing access reviews to your earlier point, we need those for a compliance framework, then those need to be added in. It's not an option, but not saying, we're doing those access reviews every week. If we're really doing them once a year or once every quarter or once every 6 months, like being accurate in that and actually following through are the biggest areas that I think, we constantly are project managing and tracking compliance for, making sure we're really doing what we say we're doing and we're not just kind of documenting it in policy. I mean, that's the number one thing I think that is tricky with the organizations. And I think it's because they're resource constrained too. I think, we've worked with some larger enterprises as well and some special projects, like doing some high trust and some other larger projects. They typically don't have the same level of issue on the policy side from overstatement. They have various versions of policies from various years that don't necessarily wait in different markets. We had a company we worked with that was in something like 16 different countries, and they had, I think, 16 different versions of policy. So that was fun. We've seen that as well. But I think in general, the smaller tech companies that are looking to get compliance, just that overstatement and that policy pack reliance, I think people are very reliant on that. They're like, oh, we just need to produce, we see it on the HR side as well. We just need to produce a handbook. It's like, yeah, but it would be nice if that handbook was fairly accurate to your organization and was a foundation that you can grow off of. To your point, Kyle, I think, about working on it for the next 4 years, like that's what we want to see. And we try to educate and kind of drive our clients in that direction, because put that work in up front and you don't end up with a giant templated mess down the road. It's much easier to keep that up to date. And most of our clients do. I don't know if you see this, Kyle, in your area, but most of our clients end up adding on additional compliance down the road. So we typically see companies that have, many of our clients actually have SOC 2 and ISO and other compliance requirements, depending on the vertical they're in. And so as time goes on too, and you need to kind of cross-reference that or deduplicate that, or use a tool like Scytale to do that deduplication for you with the multiple frameworks, making sure your policies are tight up front is worth the time, even though it's a lot of administrative work. And I know it's not the fun part sometimes for everybody that building a security and compliance program, I think there's a lot of value in doing it right the first time instead of just utilizing a giant template and kind of, doing the bare minimum, because, years 2, 3, and 4 down the road becomes a lot less sustainable. If you've said a lot of things, or to your point, Kyle, maybe something got missed even in an audit. Now you're showing, continual improvement maybe in a security program, but you're continually improving from a level that you were never at in the first place, potentially. And so that's tricky, I think, too.
And the one last point, and then I maybe want to jump a little bit into frameworks, which I think I might do here as well. I think so much of this still goes back to that education with customers, and that side, and this is where I'll maybe pull the first framework in, something like an ISO. I love explaining that when I start with customers. Cool, you're going to do ISO 27001. What does that mean as a framework? Well, you're going to have all this procedural stuff that's saying what you should do, and we're going to call that the ISMS. But then the good news, you've got all these annex controls. So you can't just be saying you're doing all of this and you aren't, because, well, then there's going to be a misalignment. But it's a framework that I find is very easy, I think, to explain or justify how you're going to go about it. Because, okay, let's start. Let's start with what's simple and what you're doing now. Case in point, as you've mentioned, your policies. Simplify it. You are doing these 5 things. There's no point having an HR policy in a company of 4 people saying you do 64 different assignments before you hire someone. And the reality is, oh, hey, I worked with this guy for the last 8 years, so that's why we hired him. And that misalignment. And again, that understanding of, look, you're going to go into an ISO audit and you're going to get opportunity for improvements, and you're going to get minor non-conformities. And that's not a bad thing. And it doesn't mean you're not prepared. It means the auditor's done their job and they've fulfilled the role to help you improve on it. So maybe, yes, thoughts on that. And maybe as the changes have happened, let's talk about ISO, but we're on the topic already.
Yeah.
2013 versus 22. Sorry, Steve.
I'm ready. I'm ready for ISO. I love ISO compared to SOC 2. ISO lays out a step-by-step process. The first parts of ISO is like inventory of the people, inventory of the clients, inventory of this, inventory all your, data, everything. And then it goes into the risk assessment. And ISO really is centered around that risk assessment. So after the risk assessment is done, then you look at your list, your Annex A list, and pick all the, things that you need to secure and, mitigate any of the risks that you've uncovered under your risk assessment. And then, and like you were saying, if you do have things you have to mitigate, ISO has a process and a plan to do that. And as long as you have those plans in place, even though, you're not 100% on this control, the fact that you have the plan in place makes you compliant to ISO, which I really enjoy.
It's more like that NIST framework kind of side of things, like plan of actions and milestones on the ISO side, because it's built up NIST. I think the nice thing with ISO is it's really an information security management system, right? The ISMS, like versus a list of controls, like a SOC 2 is mainly a list of controls.
Checkbox.
Yeah, some, depending on the trust service criteria, some are scoped in, some are scoped out, maybe some are carved out if you don't have a physical location, you're using a data center or something like that. But I think the nice thing with ISO is that it is really a soup to nuts framework for how to run an information security program. And if you do the upfront work Steve's talking about, and outside of Annex A, and you're working through the actual management system, you should be having conversations like the one we're having right now with, within your organization. And that then links to better security, which is pretty cool. The struggle I think I've seen, at least personally with ISO, sometimes with small organizations, is that it feels like a lot of management up front for them. So to your point, Kyle, I think the smallest company we've ever done ISO with was like 6 to 8 to 10 people, something like that, Steve, if that is correct. Most of them are usually much larger, but in those really small organizations, it's a little tricky because you want to show separation of duties for a particular role that's called out in your ISMS, but it may be that we only have 8 people and some of those roles are going to be, kind of duplicated and stuff. And so some of that I think feels a little bit over, kind of a little extra for those organizations in the beginning, but I do think it builds a really strong security program down the road. Whereas I do think sometimes in SOC 2, we get into we just hit these 98 controls or whatever the number may be for the particular client. And if these 98 controls are handled, like, we're secure. And I don't know that that's always the accurate, feeling that folks get on the executive teams. They think that they've got a SOC 2 in their hand, like, hey, look at this piece of paper, we're secure. And I don't know that that's always accurate, from our perspective. And so kind of working through that and trying to explain, like, hey, you're always going to have residual risk. You're always going to have, items that you can't tackle, especially when you're smaller and you have a smaller resource, and, trying to keep an eye on those. And I think ISO does a better job of that. I don't know if you agree, Steve, but I think it does a better job of the actual management side.
Yeah, SOC 2 just feels so disconnected in a way just because of the checklist. And it is a pass or fail. So you could be doing a 1 in that category and still pass. Change management. Well, do you have a ticketing system? Yes. All right, you're good. Next. Whereas ISO will dig into it, and if you read the 27002, it says, all right, for change management, you need this, you need that, you need this, you need that, you need this, you need that, and the auditors will look for that. So that's what I like about ISO. It really is a little more tied into things.
I find the comments super, super interesting, particularly with some of the recent audits I've done. And reason being, I've almost seen with some of the auditors them deep dive a bit more on SOC than ISO in a way, where procedurally, from an ISO perspective, we're almost saying, okay, are you doing what you're defining you're doing? But with a maybe more of a magnifying glass on your product that you're potentially attesting to in SOC. And I fully agree with you, Steve, that pass or fail side of things. But I mean, if we're going back to the side of, well, what does it mean, right? Well, we're doing an attestation. We're going through this process to say to an auditor, hey, your AICPA criteria are stipulating this, that, and the next thing. And in order to meet those requirements, we've put these controls in place. So what is your opinion of what we've done? And change management, case in point, smaller SaaS companies that you've seen on a daily basis, segregation of duty and authorization of changes. For all the listeners, we're going super technical here, so hang on and keep up with us.
Mm-hmm.
But I find that being a nice challenge. Like you're saying, in ISO, you're trying to implement these really industry standard procedures for a small company, or at least try and foolproof it that as you rapidly grow, it still makes sense and you're not redesigning the business. And I've seen that with a lot of customers where they're saying, okay, in a SOC 2 perspective here, we are a development team of 1. I am the CTO. I am the most senior and the most junior developer simultaneously. And now an auditor wants to see an authorization for a change. And you're saying, well, I don't have another process, man, because it's me. I have like an interest in this company. I could go and do bad things. So I get what you're saying, but what else do you do? And then you're trying to sort of make controls and find a way to bridge that gap that is still supporting the development of a product in a company of 3 people.
Yeah, it definitely happens. I like the idea, though. I will say in SOC 2, they talk a lot about the concept of a compensating control. I think in those small organizations, like to your point about, if you have a single developer, a single CTO, maybe you don't have the peer review you'd love to have because there's no peer to do that review.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe we have, a change management system that captures all changes through all time. Like we've seen that, Steve and I have seen that approach before. For instance, where all source code is recorded forever, like all changes are recorded, and kind of a neat, novel approach, and not what I'd recommend, for every development shop and every SDLC. But I think if you have a single developer and you want to show that you could roll back really easily or show just happen, if you could show that all code changes over all time have always been recorded. And there's tools for that. Like we've seen, tools used that are kind of off label for that, but we've seen things like, at one point, Tripwire, file integrity management tools used for that. Like if your source code is always in plain text, you can use versioning and things to try and get, you won't get the peer review, but you'll try to get maybe stronger on the disaster recovery and kind of BIO side of things. Like you can bring, the software back to a known good state at a known good time. Like maybe there's more reliance in that area, that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, like it is definitely different for an organization of 10 people to comply with any of these frameworks than it is for an organization of 10,000 people. And, that is something too, I think that auditors are usually pretty mindful of, and they understand that like, if you have one CTO, one developer, like, we're going to have some compensating control or some sort of workaround because we're probably not going to have that strong peer review we love to see in a typical kind of dev QA production environment. There's obviously not going to be that level of complexity if you have single developers. So luckily, I think all of our clients, I don't think any of them have a single developer, Steve, but I've run across that before. All right.
No, not yeah.
Not
I can think of, yeah.
We don't have that issue, but it's definitely a real one that's out there. I think too, what's driven Kyle on the framework side, I don't know if this is worth mentioning, but what I see is not customers selecting compliance frameworks that make sense for them. They're selecting what their potential vendors they're going to sell to. or their potential customers, what they're going to sell into. So if they're building a really cool tech widget and they're going to sell it to a really large company is oftentimes telling them, hey, in order to work with us, we prefer ISO, we prefer SOC 2, we prefer healthcare space, we see high trust a lot, we prefer high trust, or for government, obviously now CMMC is becoming a bigger topic because of the mandates and the version 2.0 that is finalized now. And I think we see a lot more of that driven by the commercial side than actually by information security or operations. It's kind of, this is what's going to happen in order to sell our product into this space. And then they kind of go back to their operating teams and say, hey, how do we get this SOC 2 or this ISO 27001 cert that we need? Because we've promised already that we're going to get it to XYZ big corporation. I think that's what I see most is just, kind of the business side driving which compliance frameworks are selected. I hate to say that, but that's kind of, I think, the reality in our space.
Absolutely agree. I think the one step even further, unfortunately, is sometimes the pressure it comes with, right? Because that sales team goes that one step further. It's not, hey, we're working on our SOC 2. It's, we have our SOC 2.
Mm-hmm.
The company hasn't even heard
they
of
always
this.
overpromise, yeah.
We've committed. We're going to have our type 2 in like 3 weeks time, man. We've got no processes around SDLC or anything on HR, but we need that in a week. And suddenly it feels like there's more pressure than potentially if you were a heart surgeon. And it's this is compliance in some work.
I always caution customers in that space to be honest with the company they're trying to sell to as best they can. I mean, I understand there's obviously sales and market pressure to say that you're further along potentially than you are in something, but going to a large organization and saying, hey, I'm going to have a SOC 2 in 3 weeks, when you have no start, even they typically, if they're mature, understand that's not reasonable. And so typically if you're working with a good, if it's vendor management, that you're trying to sell into at a big, enterprise organization, or maybe it's the security department giving you a kind of thumbs up, thumbs down on a risk assessment or something. If you're working with those teams, typically they understand too that this takes time. Most auditors aren't going to turn a SOC 2 report around in that 3-week time or right in that period. So even if you were ready and done and you'd finished your audit today, you may not get it back in 3 weeks. It depends on the time of year and how kind of backed up things are and stuff like that. So I think, usually if you're working with a competent team on the other side, they're understanding as well. And we had a lot of luck with negotiating things like, hey, we're going to have this in 6 months if we agree with you guys. And this is contingent upon this contract remaining intact, that kind of thing. And usually organizations are pretty, amenable to that if you talk about it up front. But I agree, we have run into potential customers or real customers that have gotten a little over their skis for sure. And, gotten themselves in a tough spot where you end up kind of being between that rock and that hard place because, you may need that audit in 3 weeks, but you're not going to get it. And so that's a conversation we've had. Like I said, it's usually on the pre-sale side. I've heard a few of those, but I've definitely had ones that call in on them today and say, you need to talk to on Friday. I mean, that's a real problem still out there.
Yeah, sales teams, man, we just had a client, separate from promising having SOC 2, they promised a platform that was going to be hosted. Well, that opens a whole list of other controls that we now have to comply to. And they're like, yeah, we can do that in a month. So not only do you have the team trying to stand this thing up, but we got to secure it and make it compliant before it goes to market, which is a month. And it's, it's a lot.
Yeah, we see that with existing clients. I think what you're talking about is an existing client that sell a box product and they had a good, sales opportunity and they've expanded into hosting, but they've expanded into hosting in 3 weeks time, that kind of thing. And so that's challenging. And they're a company that's already fairly mature on the GRC side of things, like on the compliance frameworks, but, trying to make sure they remain compliant while adding it in 3 weeks is always tricky, that kind of thing. So we see that even with existing customers that are already in, compliance frameworks or audits or kind of in that cycle of annual audits. But yeah, I definitely think, the education of what these products, these audits, and these security frameworks are, I think is still our biggest struggle with the executives and folks who don't work in security and compliance, is trying to understand that, there's quite a bit more to it than just getting a piece of paperwork back or a report. We need to actually get that back with, positive news on it. In order to do, we've got to build an entire security, framework in some cases or product, internally. And a lot of times, Stephen, it's not uncommon for Steve and I to talk to people who have, venture capital funding perhaps, and have a product or maybe even a wireframe of a product, but have no idea what the security needs to look like at all. And they've already been told by a healthcare system, for instance, that they're going to have a SOC 2 Type 2. And so there's a lot of moving parts there, because with some of these audits, you have periods of performance. I mean, even with an ISO, usually you have a phase 1 and phase 2, and there's timing in between all of those different pieces. And all of these founders are typically looking for, what's the fastest way that I can have, an audit in hand and move on to the next, hurdle, because they've got a lot of hurdles on their plate. So I think that's definitely, from my perspective, what I see the most.
Look, I will thank you, because you've made this very easy for marketing, in that we're definitely going to box this one as education and compliance or something along those lines. I'm also just giving you the heads up. I'm penciling you in for a second one that we're going to call evolvement in compliance.
All right.
Look, I think there's so much to actually chat about, and exactly like you're saying, that ISO stage 1, stage 2, look, I'm not going to get into that. We'll save it for the next one, but how that process has maybe been made a little bit more asynchronous and a little bit more efficient compared to what it was years ago. We'll get into some of the ISO 2013, 2022. Maybe what I'd like to wrap up with this one, again, I think so much has been shared and guided already. For anyone listening that either has been through compliance and shares the sentiments of what you've both mentioned and discussed today, maybe in closing, what you're seeing, any real final words of wisdom, what to avoid, what to do, or just what are you seeing? Close that education out for us.
I'll give you my perspective, and I'd love to hear Steve's perspective as well on this. But, I would say make strategic decisions up front about products and frameworks you're going to work in, and make sure that they're sustainable long term. So one of the things that I run into a lot, and maybe this is a technology decision, maybe it's a process or a program you're buying into, you see a lot of founders, kind of see the shiny light and they run towards whatever it may be that they want to sell to, but not think about what that means in year 2, 3, 4, 5. And so what that might mean is, we've seen it a million times, but maybe the team is fairly small. We've got 100 people right now, and we bought a product that really is designed for a company of 5,000 people. Yeah. We see this a lot in venture capital space, where they have, a bucket of resource they can use to go buy some of these products. And sometimes they get oversold. It's not uncommon that we see, an IT team of 1 with a product that really requires an IT team of 10 to run for a particular security control. And it's not sustainable. It tends to fall apart pretty fast after that initial audit in year 1. And it can be really tricky to keep that up going down the road, and very costly too, if they've bought into a bunch of enterprise products. Like, we've seen a lot of small companies get kind of caught up in software that normally you wouldn't see them buying. And so I think being careful that you right size everything, and you don't over, imagine where you're going to be. I think it's always hard as a founder, right? I think you want to envision yourself as being, we're at 1 employee today, we're going to be at 1,000 tomorrow. But I think really understanding what that roadmap needs to look like, and the right milestones along that roadmap to make those decisions, and not immediately jumping to the product that works, at 5,000 headcount or whatever it is. I think that's, the biggest takeaway that I would like to kind of share with everybody is, be careful that we don't overdo, some of these security requirements, because it can really make it hard to keep them maintained and sustainable down the road.
Yeah. And on the other end of that, between SOC 2 and ISO, they're both very flexible. And I know when clients first get that list of control, when you first show it to them, then their eyes bug out of their head. They have no idea what they're looking at. And we got to kind of break it down into chunks. But it is very break it downable. It is they don't realize they're already compliant in some things. A lot of the time. So, with change management, how do we do change management? You're already doing it. You're already doing it in your ticketing system. We just got to tweak a couple of things. Got to have an approval. We got to have a rollback plan, well, we'll fix all that. So I think in the beginning, again, they freak out. But once you get everybody moving, which does take a couple of weeks to get them moving, once you get them moving towards the goal, then they start figuring it out that they can do this, and it is something they can maintain.
I think I'm gonna take this episode, and I'm gonna make it like a mandatory step for every customer we work with as sort of a starting point. Before we dive into it, this is your hype up vid. This is what you're looking forward to, and then we go from there. Gentlemen, thank you. I'm absolutely loving this. I could absolutely talk for the next 2 or 3 hours with you both.
Yeah, I didn't even get into any AI stuff I wanted to get into, but we'll save that for next time.
Why do you think I already had to pitch the involvements in compliance to you? We've got so much we have to cover. We might end up just having a season worth of podcasts. We'll have the three of us from Jan to December or something like that. Eventually get to a point where we all just sit with nothing to say because we've discussed everything. That'll be cool.
Yeah.
Oh, that'd
I'm
be
keen.
fun.
Yeah. We might need some editing on that, but
Gentlemen, let's call that for the first one. I'm keen for part 2 to 25. For everyone listening, if you haven't found something insightful in that, you've probably had it on mute the entire way through, or you're driving somewhere and your windows are wide open and you can't hear a thing over some wind noise. So Nick and Steve, honestly, what an absolute pleasure. Thank you for your insights, your time. Absolute treat to speak to you both.
Thanks for having us, Kyle. We appreciate it.